Episode 3. Money does not control people directly. Banks don't need force. Debt doesn't need threats. Control works best when it feels like responsibility, when obligation is framed as maturity, when long-term dependence is called stability. In this episode, we're going to look at the quiet mechanics behind modern banking and debt. Not the dramatic version, not the conspiracy version, the everyday version, the kind that slowly narrows options, shapes decisions, and keeps entire populations compliant, without anyone ever feeling imprisoned. This is Banks, Debt, and Silent Slavery. Let's begin. Part 1. Banks as gatekeepers. What banks really do? Banks are often described as safe places for money, neutral service providers, financial helpers. But structurally, banks are gatekeepers. They decide who gets access to capital, under what conditions, and at what cost. They don't just store money, they filter opportunity. Banks as invisible gatekeepers. The common perception of banks: most people interact with banks in small, ordinary ways. Deposits, withdrawals, transfers, payments. From this perspective, banks appear neutral, almost boring. They feel like utilities, but this surface-level interaction hides their actual function. Banks do not simply move money, they decide where money is allowed to go. Money does not enter the economy. Neutrally, new money does not appear evenly. It enters through specific channels, primarily through loans. This means banks are not just intermediaries, they are points of entry. Who receives credit first shapes who grows first. Who waits falls behind. This initial positioning creates long-term inequality without requiring favoritism. Access is more powerful than intelligence. In theory, success is linked to merit. In practice, it is linked to access. Two individuals can have the same intelligence, the same work ethic, the same ambition, but only one may qualify for credit. That person can start earlier, absorb losses, scale faster. This advantage compounds, not because they are better, but because the system allowed them to move first. Credit as a filter, not a reward. Credit is often framed as something you earn. In reality, it is something you are evaluated for. Banks assess predictability, compliance, stability. Creativity is irrelevant. Potential is secondary. The system rewards those who already fit within it. Risk is reassigned, not eliminated. Banks are described as risk managers, but risk rarely disappears. It is transferred. Collateral shifts risk to borrowers. Interest compensates uncertainty. Public guarantees protect institutions. When failure occurs, losses are distributed outward. When success occurs, gains concentrate inward. This pattern is consistent. Why this power remains invisible? Banks rarely speak publicly about control. They don't need to. Their influence operates quietly, through approval forms, credit scores, and eligibility criteria. No speeches, no announcements. Just doors opening or remaining closed. The psychological effect. When opportunity requires permission, people internalize limitation. They adjust goals to match what feels attainable. Over time, this feels like choice. But it began as filtering. Once access is granted, the system doesn't loosen. It tightens, because access comes with conditions. Those conditions are called debt. Part 2, debt as behavior. Controlled debt doesn't just take money, it takes flexibility. People with high obligations change jobs less, speak out less, take fewer risks, not because they lack courage, but because consequences are higher. Long-term obligation, modern debt isn't short-term. It's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. This locks future behavior to past agreements. The system doesn't need to control thought. It controls timelines. Why debt is normalized? Debt is framed as smart, responsible, unavoidable. And in many cases, it is necessary. But normalization removes scrutiny. When everyone is obligated, no one questions the structure. Debt alone isn't enough. It must be maintained. That's where compliance enters. Debt is long-term behavioral control. Debt is not a moment. It is a timeline. Debt is often spoken about as a temporary condition, a phase, a bridge, something you get through. But modern debt is not brief. It stretches across decades, life stages, identities. A 30-year mortgage does more than purchase a house. It defines where you live, how long you stay, and how much risk you can afford to take. Debt doesn't just affect money, it organizes time. Future labor, committed in advance. When debt is created, future labor is pre-sold. You are not only agreeing to pay money, you are agreeing to remain employable, remain compliant, remain predictable. The system doesn't need to tell you what job to take. Debt narrows the list automatically. Why debt changes personality? Debt creates pressure long before payment is missed. People with high obligations avoid uncertainty, delay confrontation, suppress dissent. Not because they are weak, but because consequences are magnified. Risk stops feeling adventurous. It feels irresponsible. Debt and identity over time. Debt stops feeling external. It becomes identity shaping. I can't leave this job. I can't move right now. I can't afford to speak up. These statements sound personal, but they are structural. Why long-term debt is stable from a system perspective. Long-term debt is ideal. It locks behavior, stabilizes consumption, predicts future income streams. Short-term debt creates urgency. Long-term debt creates compliance. Normalization is control. Debt is no longer questioned, it is expected. Education, debt, housing, debt, healthcare, debt. When obligation becomes universal, resistance disappears. People stop asking whether the structure is reasonable. They ask how to survive within it. Moralizing debt is framed morally. Paying it is responsible. Escaping it is suspicious. This framing shifts blame. Structural pressure becomes personal failure, and shame is an effective silencer. Interest as time extraction. Interest is not just cost, it is time extracted slowly. You pay not only for what you borrowed, but for the years it keeps you obligated. This ensures the relationship lasts far longer than the original need. The quiet trade-off. Debt trades freedom for predictability, and predictability is valuable to employers, lenders, and systems. Once traded, freedom becomes expensive to reclaim. Debt alone does not enforce obedience, it creates vulnerability. The next layer turns vulnerability into self-regulation. That layer is compliance. Part 3, compliance without force. Why force is unnecessary. The most stable systems don't rely on violence. They rely on incentives. Miss a payment, you feel it immediately. Challenge the system, your safety net weakens. This teaches caution. Stability over truth. People don't stop questioning because they don't care. They stop because children depend on them, rent is due, health insurance is tied to work. Stability becomes more valuable than honesty. Compliance without coercion. Why force is unnecessary? Force is inefficient. It creates resistance. It invites rebellion. It requires constant energy. Stable systems don't rely on force. They rely on incentives. Debt creates consequences that operate automatically. No threats are needed. No authority has to speak. The structure enforces itself. Self-regulation is more effective than policing. When people are indebted, they monitor themselves. They ask, is this safe? What if this fails? What could I lose? These questions don't come from fear of punishment. They come from fear of instability. And instability has been framed as personal failure. Stability becomes the highest value. As obligations grow, stability becomes sacred. Not growth, not truth, not freedom. Stability. People accept unfulfilling work, unfair conditions, limited futures. Because stability protects dependence, not just individuals. Compliance is framed as maturity. Compliance is not presented as submission. It is framed as adulthood. Being responsible, being realistic, knowing how the world works. Questioning the structure is labeled naive. Acceptance is labeled wisdom. The silent contract. There is an unspoken agreement. If you behave predictably, pay on time, don't disrupt, stay productive. The system will allow you to remain stable, not comfortable, not free, stable. Why protest feels risky. People often ask why more don't resist. Resistance threatens income, credit, reputation, future opportunity. Debt ensures consequences are personal, not collective. This isolates risk. Isolation neutralizes movements. No single oppressor. This system doesn't require a villain. No one needs to issue commands. Responsibility is internalized. People blame themselves for pressures that were designed. Silent slavery clarified. This is not slavery of force. It is slavery of constraints. You are free as long as your freedom does not interfere with repayment. At this stage, the question changes. It's no longer who is in control. It becomes why is escape so rare? Part 4, why escape is rare. The escape story. People are told most systems survive by offering a story of escape. Work harder, learn more, invest wisely, start something. And for a small number of people, this works. These exceptions are highlighted, not to free the many, but to justify the structure. Why most people can't leave escape is not only about effort. It requires spare time, spare capital tolerance for uncertainty. Debt removes all three. Every obligation narrows the margin for error. Risk stops being strategic. It becomes dangerous. The timing problem. Even correct decisions can fail if timed poorly. Debt punishes poor timing harshly. This makes experimentation rare. Stability is chosen not because it's optimal, but because it's survivable. Systems. Adapt, not collapse. When pressure builds, systems respond. Relief programs appear. Rules are adjusted. Language changes, but control remains. Change is permitted as long as predictability is preserved. Awareness is not escape. Understanding this system does not free you overnight. Awareness is not rebellion, it is orientation. You begin to see why choices feel limited, why pressure feels constant, why effort doesn't always translate. This clarity reduces shame, and shame is one of the system's most effective tools. The real first step. Escape is not a single action. It begins with asking different questions, not, how do I win? But what does this system reward? Once you know that, you move differently, more deliberately, more selectively. Banks do not need to dominate. Debt does not need to threaten. Control works best when it feels voluntary. When people believe they are choosing freely, the system no longer needs to convince them. In the next episode, we will examine the illusion of choice in politics, media, and modern freedom. Because once choice itself is managed, control becomes complete. I'll see you in the next episode.